Today's guest is Gareth Marlow, executive coach at EQ Systems. I've known Gareth for a number of years. We worked together at a company called Redgate, where he was in fact the person who hired me into the company. And Gareth has a very sort of broad spectrum of experience. He's an engineer by sort of education. He did chemical engineering. Then he spent a large part of his career working hands-on with technical projects. And when I got to know him, he was on sort of a senior management track, and now he spends most of his time advising startups, leadership teams, and CEOs on how to build great cultures within software organizations. So my conversation with Gareth actually was quite long, and the reason is that we in the course of our conversation, a number of interesting things came up from his point of view, and the one thing that I would point out to in particular is what he described as the feedback loop, which is something, you know, as maybe engineers or as humans we understand. The point really is about how hard it is for us to see the feedback loop in action when it comes to environmental issues. So we'll get on with the episode. I'll see you at the end of the show with some concluding thoughts as usual. And in the meantime, here's Gareth. Let me just give you a quick intro and tell you what I've been doing with other people, and then we can just have a bit of a conversation about it. So,
sure.
The sort of the it's actually something which I think I've kind of mentioned sort of in passing when we met up for a coffee, right? Which is that I've been sort of surprised that in tech, in our industry, right? So tech, software, SaaS, the events that surround the industry and so on. I personally at least don't come across conversations about sustainability, environmental responsibility, climate change, climate crisis, emergency, whatever the terminology is, right? And it happens to be something I personally am quite interested in and worried about. So I couldn't really put a finger on why we're not talking about it, but rather than sort of navel gaze too much, I was like, you know what, let's do something and start to see whether people want to have a conversation. Why don't you explain to me, however you want to, what it is that, who are you? What are you up to nowadays? So it's easy into with something that should be comparatively easy to talk about.
You'd think, right? Okay, well, I'm basically a technologist, and I have been throughout my whole career. So my academic background is chemical engineering, which is kind of ironic in the context of this conversation, but maybe we'll explore some of that a little bit later. So I took myself off to university in 1990 to study chemical engineering, and decided while I was there that it wasn't for me. Really on the basis of some work experience that I did. So I was working on an oil refinery and then a gas separation plant up in Fife for Shell, and then in Shell's headquarters. So I was sponsored by Shell through my degree. And then at the same time at college, I was the green officer on my college student union. So I'm sort of already trying to reconcile these two positions. So yeah, sort of coming to the end of my degree and thinking, this isn't really for me. But fortunately for me, the internet was happening at that time. Mm-hmm. So you're in the Wild West where anybody who knew one end of an Ethernet cable from the other could get a job in tech, and so that was sort of how I started. So worked really just kind of building out IT systems for organizations for about a decade, and then moved across into general management, managing people, and then ultimately a whole organization over the next 10 years. And then about 3 years ago, I decided that I wasn't enjoying being a senior manager at a software company anymore, at least for the while. So I then moved across into doing the parts of that job that I really loved, which was working with people to help them develop and working with teams to help teams get better. So for the last three and a bit years, I've been coaching the people leading technology companies, mainly in Cambridge, but a few further afield. And I'm off to Germany at the weekend to do some work in Germany for a week and a half. But yeah, mainly in Cambridge, London, Southeast UK.
Okay, so you coach CEOs.
Coach CEOs, CTOs, C-level, VP level people.
What are you coaching now? I think a lot of people might not be familiar with coaching, except maybe in a sports context. Like, what does a CEO need coaching for?
That's a really great question, because business coaching came out of sports coaching. So really, the world of sporting started to understand that a lot of the barriers to getting the next level of performance in the sports arena, those barriers were as much mental as they were physical. And there was a seminal work from the mid-70s by a guy called Professor Tim Galway, and he's professor, I think. And he wrote.
Is it the medical guy, the surgeon?
No, he wrote. No, it's he wrote The Inner Game of Tennis.
Okay.
Okay. So this, which is kind of on the surface, is a book about the inner game of tennis. In fact, it's about the inner game of anything. So the sports world understood that psychology was key to performance 30, 40 years ago. The business world started waking up to this maybe 20 years ago. So I think that's roughly how long my current industry has been an actual thing. And so what does that mean in reality? Well, typically people have both a lack of clarity over what it is that they and their organizations and their teams need to be doing, and or a lack of confidence in what they and their teams and their organizations need to be doing. So I work with people and teams on helping them to establish clarity over what it is that they're trying to achieve, where they're trying to go, how they're going to get there, how this is all going to work, and confidence. So they have they're more self-assured as people and as teams in what it is that they're trying to do. So how does this show up? A lot of one-on-one work, conversations like this, either face-to-face or over video, and a fair amount of teamwork as well. So picking a specific question like what do we need to focus on next year, and working on that with the team. Our existing market is starting to slow down. Where are we going to go next? Working with a team on that kind of question.
Okay. And you're not giving them the answers. You're helping them sort of work their way through. Okay.
That's it. We have this notion of something called non-directive coaching. So non-directive coaching is essentially a dialogue, but the coach is not adding content really into that conversation. They are shepherding it, and they are being a sounding board for the other person, but they're not adding content into the conversation. Where I sit is somewhere a little bit more content specific than that. So there may be some things where I know stuff. I've got some useful frameworks. I've got some useful experience that might be relevant to the people that I'm working with. But my coaching tutor, when I went through the formalized program to become an executive coach, my coaching tutor had a great phrase that has stayed with me ever since, and I refer back to once a week, which is, it's not your job to do the thinking for them. Okay, so as a coach, I'm here to help you think. And if I've got some information that you don't have, which is relevant to your thinking process, then I will introduce that. But it's not my job to come up with the answer for you. I've got to try and help you get to your best answers.
Okay. Which, because I know a tiny bit about coaching, is sort of why I was interested in speaking to somebody who's a coach, because not that I expect you to have any sort of like solutions up your sleeve to big sort of like global crises, but because it's hard to think about these kinds of problems, it's good to speak to people who are working on how to think about tricky problems, right? But before we get into that, so when I asked when I asked Peldi why he accepted my invitation to join to do this in recording, his response was like, "Well, because I know you," which is very nice of him. But I've sort of been asking everybody this question because it is a sort of a tricky subject. It arouses like different emotions in different people. So, you know, you could have very easily responded to my email with like, not really my thing, or I don't know much about it, or, you know, I'm too busy, which I'm sure is the case. Why did you say, all right, let's do this?
Because I know you. No. Why did I say yes? Well, look, I mentioned, nearly 30 years ago, I'm at college, and it's obvious that this whole thing is not sustainable even then. You know, it's obvious that like even to a 18, 19-year-old just really starting to make my way into the adult world, that this whole thing is not sustainable, you know. And when I was a kid, the crisis, the environmental crisis, was around things like pollution and acid rain and bit of deforestation, save the whale, those kinds of things. So it was about despoiling the environment, and which is obviously important and upsetting, but very much I think perceived as a tree huggy type of thing.
So more of a conservation.
More of a conservation
thing. Health, like.
Right, yeah, right. Rather than a sort of sustainability question. And the sustainability question was the energy crisis. But the energy crisis was, turns out we're pumping the stuff out of the ground faster and faster, and we're consuming it more and more, and we're going to run out. And so therefore we've got a cliff coming, which is how are we going to provide energy? And it was interesting, we're talking about fracking now. Even then there was stuff that I was reading as a kid that was talking about, there's these, great shale gas reserves that when the more easy to access North Sea oil and the Arabian oil and the, Gulf of Mexico oil starts to run out, then, well, okay, it's going to be harder and more expensive, but we can probably get some stuff out from over there. That will buy us another couple of decades, And it was just, the worry was the needle's running down on the source of energy. So what are we going to do? And that's what most people are concentrating on. And it sort of felt fairly obvious. I think this is where the chemical engineering thing comes in part, because one of the things that you're doing in chemical engineering is it's really about transformation. You're building big machines, and it's taking materials in one form on one side and splitting them out in another form. So crude oil in one end and gas and petrol and kerosene and tar out of the other, right? So you're designing those whole big systems to do that transformation. And so, you've got feedback loops in there. You've got more of a sense that, okay, well, we've got this machine that's transforming faster and faster and faster. And the concern there was, what if it runs out of stuff to transform? But when you take a step back and you think about it, it was like, well, what about all of that other stuff that's going on? We're transforming energy. We're shifting massive amounts of energy that have been converted and captured in chemical form, converted from sunlight hundreds of millions of years ago, captured in chemical form and buried under the ground. And now that's been released at a massive scale. Like, that energy's sort of got to go somewhere. And then, and then all of the waste products, there's a lot of carbon in there. Where's the carbon going? So you're starting to see that there's a problem. Now, very interestingly, one of the things that I think is probably makes me quite unusual is that I'm a fairly strong exponent of nuclear power.
Okay.
And that's already a sort of quite a controversial position, I think, to hold. And the issue with nuclear power is, for me, is two things. One is safety, and then the other thing is how you manage the long-term aspects of the waste. Now, in the context of nuclear power, the volume of waste isn't actually that great, but the nature of it is, horrendous. If you lose containment over that waste, then you are catastrophically impacting the whole ecosystem. So they are really big ifs, but in there, just in terms of the ability to transform and generate energy, it's absolutely tremendous. And if there was any solution, I read something recently that basically sort of said that if, as a society, we hadn't swung so hard against nuclear power 30 years ago, our CO2 emissions by this point would probably be somewhere near being on track for what we need them to be. And that's a really interesting paradox. So we might have shifted things.
Where did you read that?
Well, I could dig up a reference and send it across to you, but I've read that in the last week or two. I'll dig up a reference and send that across to you. So that's a really interesting question, because it's not like, what I'm not saying is, if we hadn't made dumb decisions, everything would be fine, because that's patently not the case. But certainly we made I'm not sure that the risk profile around the decision making around nuclear power was logical. And so we kind of stopped.
That's an interesting one. I don't know much about nuclear power in general, except that I know, sort of from environmental points of view, there are concerns around how the raw material is mined, right? In terms of the impact to the local society, environment, and so on. So you were sort of working for Shell. You were at the same time a green officer, so you could already see the things were not kind of like quite right. And I think the rhetoric at the time was not quite as grim as it is now, or the science wasn't as grim. The rhetoric was more conservation based. What's the situation now in your head? Like, if you imagine, like there's a bit of a spectrum in some way, to simplify things, where you have some people on one extreme are, Extinction Rebellion, the world is ending, we need to panic, have no more kids, blah, blah, blah. On the other end, you've got, Trump pulling out of the Paris Accords just literally today. Climate science denial, right? Everything's fine. This is just, a bunch of bullshit by some tree-hugging hippies. Where do you stand? What's, if you honestly say where you are there, what's your assessment of the current situation?
So my assessment of the current situation is that my beliefs are way closer to the XR people in terms of what would need to be done in order to avoid shock change. And I think the thing is that this insight has been around for a long, long time. So it's just not been very evenly distributed. And what we're seeing now is, through XR and others, we're seeing that information really being distributed more into the mainstream. But it's been there for a long time. I mean, when I say that 40 years ago or 30 years ago, most of the conversation was about conservation, that's true. That's most of the mainstream conversation. But in particular, the systems thinking environmentalists were already over this.
Oh, yes. There was evidence recently in a hearing in the States. I can't remember who it was, but, that I think one of the big oil companies had these predictions of where we would be today in the 70s, in black and white. So the science was definitely there. So it wasn't widely distributed.
Exactly. And I think, I think the interesting point is well, what do you do and what should you do? I mean, the thing is that ultimately the systems in which we play a part, the sort of wider ecosystem, the biosphere, and those kinds of things are way, way, way more powerful than mankind is, you know? And so...
How do you mean? In what way?
In as much as, you know, it just takes, you just need to go somewhere where you can see that coastal defences, for instance, have been built and are now starting to prove inadequate. For you just to realise just how much little extra effort it takes in terms of natural forces just to destroy what you've put in place. You know, the dam in Derbyshire, was it, that was breached 3 or 4 months ago?
Just a couple of months ago.
Yeah. So, you know, all right, it might not have been very well maintained, or, you know, those kinds of things, but you just get one little breach and you start getting water flowing over, and then suddenly, you know, you're into dropping sandbags from helicopters, and that's our hope to try and protect a town. Now they've managed to have done it in that case, but that's like like one little tiny bit of defense. You start getting a whole section of coastline where those things are being breached regularly, and you're pretty much nothing you can do about that other than escape. You know, I was in I was lucky enough to go to New Orleans 7 or 8 years ago, and never been to that part of the world before, and it's absolutely fascinating because you just feel the oppressive weight of the environment on that city the whole time. The humidity, the water everywhere. You take off from a plane and you just kind of see it's almost at any point ready to engulf everything that people are putting there. You know, a little tiny bit of water rise, and what we saw with Katrina.
Yeah.
You know, what we saw with Katrina was actually a relatively small change in terms of water levels and those kinds of things, and yet you breach those defenses and you know, you lose the city. Now what happened with Katrina in New Orleans is that you had a poor city that wasn't that important to the global economy, so shrug. You know, we've had to some less affluent people have had to be permanently relocated, shrug. And that's what we've done. The next one could be Miami, or could be Sydney, or could be Manhattan. And you know, I suspect that actually it's going to take one of those, because my God, if Katrina and New Orleans was not enough to make people go, oh, well, hang on, is there something here that we should be doing something about?
Yeah.
You know, to have the Trump and that populist, this is a bunch of tree huggers trying to take away our coal mining jobs narrative still in place in 2019, when you had something like Katrina happening back then, basically makes you wonder, well, what would it take for people to sit up and wake up? And so in terms of what it is that we actually need to do, it is significant systemic change in consumption.
Okay.
But in terms of what it's going to take in order to be able to get that to happen, it's going to take shock. It's going to take shock, and I suspect that it will be the shock that nature delivers to mankind, and that's going to be significant. That's going to mean lots of lives lost, disrupted. Lots of economies, disrupted. So, yeah, the ironic thing is that we've probably got some very significant economic disruption coming our way. It's just down to us to decide whether or not we are going to kind of, quote, inflict that upon ourselves and deal with managing that change to a more sustainable economy, or whether we're just going to get our asses handed to us and have to mop up afterwards. And I fear, I fear for the latter.
I kind of agree with you that probably what we need is exactly sort of significant systemic change, right? In consumption and in a few different attitudes. But let's bring this back to our industry. I sent you a couple of links before we chatted. I don't know whether you had a chance to look at them, but two of them in particular were from The Guardian, the tree huggers. But but there were two articles about the internet's carbon footprint.
Okay.
And one of them is from not even 10 years ago, from 2010, so almost 10 years ago, which at the time positioned the carbon footprint of the internet as around half the UK's carbon footprint.
Okay.
A second article from last year positioned the internet's carbon footprint as about to be larger than the global travel carbon footprint. Right? Now, I'll be the first to raise my hand. I don't know enough about the research here, so I don't know what they're taking into account. Yeah. So I don't know whether they're, taking it, whether it's just the infrastructure, whether it is all the way to charging this, whether it's the daily use. So I don't know. But in the space of 10 years, so we had some of this research 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The problems, certainly the internet's grown exponentially. And yet I've barely heard of this. Of large tech companies, or of you, so of many other people. It's not a thing. We just buy more racks. We just buy more server space, blah, blah, blah. So here's the thing. Why isn't this a topic in tech? Why don't we care enough to have this conversation? Or maybe it's not caring. I don't know what the thing is, but why is this not something that we take into consideration when we're building a new company, when we're building a new product, when we're planning anything in software? I'm generalizing. I'm sure some companies do. I think we can do, but
so I think that we can, I think we can take the tech out of the question and just say, why do we not think about sustainability whenever we're doing anything? So I think that tech is not, tech is just the current way that the human species is focusing on its greed and its consumption. It's the means that we're using to consume.
But arguably, sorry to cut you off right away.
Yeah, sure.
Because the thing is that of all the industries, right, that we could talk about, tech is probably one of the few where there is a majority of people working in it that you would think would be paying attention to scientific statements, such as the ones we're hearing, right? So I could guess that maybe if you're in the coal industry, you don't want to hear it. I could guess that maybe if you're in, I don't know, some kind of maybe entertainment, you might be like, oh, well, yeah, we can do some small thing with the way we're shooting films and whatever. But these people are actors, makeup artists, blah, 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 designers. Whereas we're an industry full of engineers with computer science degrees. Right?
Yeah. But in general, the pure engineer with the computer science degree is not deciding where the resources are spent. So the decisions that are being taken, look, I work across quite a wide spectrum of organizations. So I'm not just working in commercial technology, but let's just concentrate on commercial technology for now. Yeah, when you're trying to decide what to do, you're in a competitive situation. It might be a real competitive situation, or it might be an artificially induced one because your funders have basically said you need to achieve this level of growth so that we get our level of return in this time period. So there's a huge amount of pressure from the financial system to generate growth and to generate return. And that exists whether or not you're in, coal mined commodities, building roads, building railways, building technology. The seductive mantra is growth. somebody who I really like his writings is Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, currently of LinkedIn, while PayPal and so on and so forth. Yeah, he's a really smart guy, and he knows a lot about building actually quite purposeful organizations that are here to achieve something. But nevertheless, you know, what's the title of his latest book? Blitzscaling. You know, how do we build these things at a, you know, faster and faster and faster rates of growth? I took a tour of an Amazon fulfillment center a couple of months ago at up at Peterborough. So, you know, big logistics warehouses, and absolutely fascinating for the geek in me. You know, you got these absolutely brilliant, cool systems in there, systems of people and technology, and they're taking sort of bulk deliveries in one end, sorting it in a very intelligent way, and then shipping it out to consumers out the other end. And it's vast. And I think that all of the stock in there turns over something like every 3 days. So when you just see how much stuff is there, you know, it's quite amazing, and it's quite efficient, and it's quite cool. But then you wander around inside, and you're wandering up and down the shelves, looking at what's on the shelves, and what's on the shelves is shit. Shelves and shelves of shit.
Okay, what do you mean by shit? You mean
I just mean like you know, you've got a kid. I've got, you know, too many children not to be embarrassed about my offspring's carbon footprint and my decisions about that, right? But you know what it's like. We've got Christmas around the corner, and what's going to happen? We've got these cheap, mass-produced toys, lumps of plastic that they're not really going to be played with, right? Some of them will, and that'd be great. And then probably 3/4 of them will get opened and looked at and then set aside. And that will happen because they are cheap. Because it's, you know, it's easy for an uncle or something like that to buy a nice little present, and there you go. But what we're doing is that we're sort of fueling the urge to, you know, be seen to be generous. And that sounds really snarky. But, you know, it's like, I want to feel good. I want to buy you a little thing. And, oh, I've just looked at that, and that looks good. But then we're in this thing where it's like, oh, yeah, that's nice, really, thank you. And then that just thing gets tossed aside. And then, you know, if you're lucky, that stuff's in a good enough form to maybe pick up some of the stuff that's been put aside and take it off to a charity shop or something like that. But it's probably going to end up in landfill pretty quickly. That's just one little stream. If you look at something like clothing, the fashion industry, you know, you've got the vast majority of the clothes that are produced are again, they're going to end up in landfill or some form of recycling within 12 months of them being manufactured, and a good 50% of them will never have been worn in that whole process. And it's basically because we've got a system in place where we can exploit the natural resources, we can exploit the cheapness of labor at the start of the manufacturing train, and because we can produce so cheaply and so efficiently and distribute so cheaply and efficiently, you know, what do? We don't really want to go to the shops, so we'll order 2 or 3 different sizes of clothes and styles and stuff like that. We'll get it shipped to our houses, we'll try it on, we'll send 3/4 of it back. You know, we'll keep a quarter where it wants, but it was, you know, it was relatively cheap. If you can have a t-shirt for £1, if you can buy a t-shirt for £1, you don't really care, do you? So, you know, we have these things and these big engines that we have built to drive growth and to drive consumption. And the main forces that we have flowing over these engines are economic. So we're saying that the important thing to do in terms of society's benefit is create wealth. So we'll invest in here and we'll generate growth, and then we'll generate a return over here. And it's almost like that's the game. Except the problem is that game is not sustainable, and that game does not recognize the full cost and the full impact of that entire process. So, you're sitting inside that world, whether or not you're in a tech company or, you know, fashion company or you're, you know, you're, like I say, building roads or mining coal, and everything is signaling towards you that basically says, okay, you know, you've got to win, you've got to grow, that's it. And if you're not doing those things, you'll be punished.
Okay,
you know?
so once you start going down this road, it's very easy to become sort of very fatalistic and sort of guilt-ridden, right?
Yeah.
Because now there are some things which you can certainly on a personal level not do, like you can buy less shit.
Yeah.
Right? Or at least you can choose to buy shit which you'll use, for example, so that at least you're being a bit more mindful about things. But for it's tricky, isn't it? Because you don't want to go through. It's not. I don't think the goal should be that we're going through life being sort of filled with guilt about anything we're doing, right? And a part of that is doing the right thing, because you're feeling guilty because you're not doing the right thing. Like at some level, you know that something is not right in what you're doing. Either you're hurting or harming something, or exploiting something, or whatever, right? So that's one thing, but. You know, for a company of any size, really, but for again, focusing it on tech a little bit, just because, well, as you said, there's sort of the latest incarnation of like the it's where our heads are at the moment, a lot of us, and a lot of the things are being enabled by tech. So like, you know, it's true that Amazon has all the on the ground logistics, but it's the software on the phone and the engineers and the UX designers who are enabling this like one click you know, thing. Not to put the blame on them either. But to bring it back to these kinds of organizations, if you as an organization, you know, want to actually do something, right, so that you're not feeling guilty by actually doing the right thing, how do we think about that? This is where I'm asking sort of like the coach, right, rather than the sort of student environmentalist. Like, you know, if a CEO comes to you, with, you know, you said, like, you know, they come to you with questions like, what do we focus on next year? How do we deal with this? Maybe make this division profitable, or this, or I don't know. Like, somebody comes to you and says, like, well, you know, how do we stop playing this game, right? How do we get to be not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative, right? Or whatever even the right way of thinking about it is. You know, how should somebody even start thinking about that when they're running a business or a division, or in some way kind of, you know, have some influence within an organization?
So again, that's a great question. You sent across a link to the B Corp.
Yes.
Stuff. And I think that, you know, there is something there around the inception of organizations that basically wires broader stakeholders into what it is that the organization is trying to do. I think that can be a very positive thing, because what we are basically saying is we are not just an engine to build wealth for investors. We have a number of different stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders is wider society and our wider, you know, environment. So, you know, I think that there are things that you can do really early on to adopt articles of association and those kinds of things along those lines that recognizes, it's not just about this single myopic approach. You know, we do this, but we do this sustainably. So I think you can do that. I think that all of the worthy things that organizations, you know, enlightened organizations try to do are a good thing. So some of them maybe actually it's not going to make any difference in terms of the shift of consumption, but it may well make a difference in terms of the shift of mindset. Okay, so I don't know what effect what I don't really know what effect the various different levers that you could pull domestically are. You know, from what I understand, if you want to minimize your carbon footprint, the best thing that you can possibly do as an individual or as a family is not have kids. So, you know, but nevertheless, you know, one more walking into central Cambridge to do the shopping over driving the car into central Cambridge to go and do the shopping is making your difference. And even though in the grand scheme of things, it will, you know, individually achieve nothing, if it's something that just forces the conversation and forces the thinking to be that little bit more enlightened and a little bit more aware, I think that that is only a good thing. So the things that organizations can do now, like thinking about consumption, offsetting, even if they're, you know, or just like, do we need to do this? Do we all need to go to that trade show? Do we all need to, you know, do those things? You know, they are accessible.
Okay.
But in terms of like the broader, the challenges in terms of the broader things that we could collectively have more impact over, it's going to take leverage at some of the more leveraged points. You know, it's going to take the major cloud providers coming along and saying, you know, we will only compete in on a sustainable playing field. But that's going to take Google and Microsoft and Amazon. And I'm just picking the, you know, it's a very Western-centric view that I have. I have a very, you know, Eurocentric and Western-centric view. Yep. But nevertheless, there's a lot is going through that part of our global system. You know, it's going to take moves from those players to really make a big difference in terms of that overall footprint. Because, yeah, I can choose to buy that rack or not. I can choose to, you know, the thing is we're even further divorced away from it, right? Because when I started my career, consumption of technology involves phoning somebody up and then delivering bits of metal and plastic and silicon to your office, and you bolting it together and plugging it in and seeing the electricity bill go up and having to order in a new aircon unit for that server room. So it was all very tangible, you know? Whereas now it's like, okay, I'll just spin up another instance on EC2, and you don't see any of that stuff, right?
Yeah, that's we don't really have time to go into that properly, but that's something that bothers me a lot. The sort of the something that tech has created, this sort of disconnect between what you're actually, you know, you click a button and the food gets to your door. It's great in one way, but you're completely disconnecting people from the process of food production, of the stress involved, and other things, right? So electricity consumption, you know, the cloud makes it sound like it's this magical sort of like great place. But I've seen data centers.
Yes.
They're you know, they're it's like looking at an oil rig. in a lot of ways.
And I think the thing is, like, in order to be able to affect change, or in order to be able for people to be the change that they need to be, you need the feedback loop, you know? So what did the Victorians do in Britain with growing cities and growing population density? What did they do with their systemic environmental problem? Their systemic environmental problem was back to the scatological, I'm afraid, but how are we going to deal with sewage? So, and, you know, when the big, great sort of Victorian industrial cities like Liverpool and London and those, you know, other cities like that were really growing in the second half of the 19th century, they had this big problem. It's like, what are we going to do with the crap? So they went, okay, well, it's fine, because the solution to that problem is we just dilute it. The sea is big, poos are small, we'll just build a 2-mile pipe out and pump this stuff out. Okay, and we'll just pump it out and it'll dissipate. But it didn't take very long for that very same waste to start washing back up on beaches. So again, you know, we're back to the start of the conversation. When I was a kid, the environmental focus in the area where I grew up, which was by Liverpool, was getting the River Mersey clean. And the River Mersey wasn't clean because it had the crap pumped into it. It had a lot of industrial effluent pumped into it. So you could see the problem, right? You could see the feedback loops. You could see, or that, you know, you had that information coming back to you. You could see some water there that you wouldn't in your wildest dreams think of going in or touching or anything like that. So you got these nice, so these, you know, the right things happened, and we you know, we started to deal with that stuff properly, and then the fish started returning to the River Mersey, and, you know, you're kind of making progress. But you're making progress in part because people are looking at the smoke and the filth and going, we're doing that, you know, and like, that's fairly obvious that we need to be not doing that. But our problem at the moment is, you know, ironically, one that primary school kids can understand, because primary school kids in their classrooms have all got pictures of the water cycle and the energy cycle, and they've got the food chains and all of this kind of stuff. So these very basic systemic sustainability concepts, it's like, look, you've got a box here, and the, you know, the box is bounded, and the only stuff that's really coming into it is sunlight. So, you know, everything that you change in that box is still going to stay there within the box. But you know, our real problem is that what we don't see, the big shift is energy locked in through sunlight, trapped underground, released, and then what gets released in that whole process also speeds up the whole process of worsening. And that systems are counterintuitive for most people. And this is, you know, this is quite a complex system in some respects, and it's one that you can't just stand there and watch it happen. You know, I can go into my kitchen and I can turn on the tap with the plug in the kitchen sink, and it's going to be fairly obvious that within 5 or so minutes that's going to be full and water is going to be spilling out. Okay, so I can see how that works, and I can also see that if I pull the plug out, it's either going to start draining, but if it doesn't start draining, that means that the water's still coming in faster than it's draining out, so I need to turn off the supply, right? We can see tangibly batching and, you know, all of those different components of how that bit of the system works. What we can't see, because it's hard for us to get that perspective, is exactly the same kind of thing that's happening when you are driving more moisture into the atmosphere, and then that moisture gets released over your countryside, and then it lands on areas of ground where it's going to run off. And where's it going to run off to, and how's it going to run off? Well, that's constrained by how quickly that water can move back out. And that water is flowing through our towns and our villages and our cities in rivers, and we've built right up to the edges of those rivers. And, you know, and on a normal day, the water level difference is 1 meter or 1.5 meters. But then, you know, it just takes a 1 or 2% different increase in the water that sort of gets dumped further upstream for that stuff to go. Well, you know, it's physics, right? Like, it's like, I've got that much water to get through. It can't possibly stay in this channel, because physics is going to determine how quickly it moves through. So where's that water going to go? Well, all of those new build starter homes that you've jammed in on that floodplain that hasn't been touched for 400 years.
Yes.
But I can sit with my kids in the kitchen and show them that in the kitchen sink, and they will get it. But you try to go to society and say their interdependence between, you know, the waste that you are producing, the effect that has on the water cycle. You know, your houses are getting flooded in part because of dumb decisions that were taken about where they should be built,
right?
And because of this exacerbated more moisture, greater volumes of water, which is human-centric. You know, we are collectively all doing this. So, you know, I mean, okay, so how do we make this less depressing and more positive?
Well, so
sorry, go on.
No, first of all, I've made a note of this actually, because the feedback loop term is something I'm familiar with, of course, but not something I've sort of joined up with this problem before and it's a good way of summarizing it for me, because this, the increasing layers of disconnect between, what's on your phone and what's actually happening, I would make it easier to do more of the, harmful things, right?
Yeah.
So in my head, I'm thinking, one of the things, if you want to make a change, or at least understand what's happening, kind of visualizing the feedback loop is a place where you can start.
Yeah.
Right. As whatever you are, whether you're just, cleaning your house or running a company, but I never thought about it that way. When you're paying Amazon for server space, one of the things you're not seeing your CFO coming to you every month with like, our electricity bill is going up.
Yeah.
Right. You just don't see that. What
And,
you're seeing is you're seeing your AWS bill go up, but you're offsetting that against the profit you're making.
Yeah. And I like this exact question. The costs shift around in organizations. I've been here so many times professionally where it's like, okay, we need more servers. So you buy more servers and you put them in the server room and whatever. And then you realize that your cooling is not adequate and your power is not adequate, or not going to be adequate for where it's going. So, but because one of the other aspects of this kind of feedback loop systems stuff is latency. So there is a disconnect, not just in terms of distance and me not being able to see it from the effect of my action, but there's also distance in time. So I'm a development manager. I'm going, my devs need the new build system. Can you provision me a new server? So I am making my decision now, but the impact on that, it will probably take some time to ripple through in terms of, the electricity bill and the power and the cooling and all of that kind of stuff. And probably nobody will go back to the dev manager who will have made a financial decision about whether or not to do that, or have been involved in the process. But it will be about the cost of the hardware and the software. But then there's this concealed cost that shows up later, and it might turn up on the profit and loss statement, but it will be just some overheady cost. If that's not in the cost of development, that's just in the big bucket of facilities. So there is a disconnect, even in a small. We both work together in a very human-sized organization, and even in that very human-sized organization, there is and one which I would regard as being an enlightened and self-aware organization. There's still just a big disconnect there between, okay, today I need to go and do the thing, so provision me some more things, and the true impact of the cost, even when that cost does come directly back, to the thing.
Okay, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, because we're sort of already been chatting for almost an hour, which is great. But can you tell me the positive thing you were going to mention before?
Well, we have done this before. We have been able to grasp the nettle on occasions before and make some change. Now, it's pretty profound, the changes that we would need to make, but we have done it. And if I kind of think, after the Second World War and during that sort of 50s, particularly that sort of 50s period of the British economy is just starting to get back together. There was this terrible problem of smog, particularly in London and the cities. And it was because, sooty, coal burning, dirty burning, not CO2, right? It was, well, obviously CO2, but not, the problem was the particulates. Okay, so you've got this dirty fuel that's being burnt and people were dying. So, respiratory problems and very significant. And
there was the famous sort of, 6 days in London, the Churchill's sort of time, right? So
exactly. So, but we grasped the nettle. And I imagine that process was significantly economically disruptive. But we prohibited the burning of those fuels in those places, and we cleaned up our atmosphere. When I was a kid, there was a big program to transition the UK over to North Sea gas. So previously previously the gas had been generated by heating up coal, which releases carbon monoxide and methane, and then we captured that, and then that was what the gas was in that we burn. And then when North Sea gas came on stream in the mid-70s, we deployed that. Now it's a lot greener. It's not great, but it's a lot greener. It was obviously a lot cheaper for Britain. But that required, from what I understand, virtually every gas burning device to be modified right across the UK. So British Gas came out and they changed your cooker, or changed the components in your cooker and your boiler and these different things. Okay, we can undertake significant sort of infrastructure.
Well, I mean, we roll out things like 4G in a couple of years now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So
now, what the difference with 4G is you're not taking something away, and I think that's where the thing is. But we can do it. The difficulty is
but in terms of deploying the financial, the people, getting the things actually done.
Yeah, it's doable, right? It's doable. We can do it. I think that the challenges that what you had with that clean air stuff in the 50s and 60s, and with the transition to natural gas, was you basically had a consistent narrative from those in leadership positions, basically saying, look, this is not it's not really negotiable. We've just got to do it, and here's the reason why. And I suspect that people were kind of more or less, okay, well, I get it, and we've got to do it. Yeah. Whereas now, for whatever reasons, there's a significant narrative there that's not saying that is saying something else, that is saying, we've got a very cynical view of what's happening with fracking in the UK at the moment, and the fact that that's been suspended, but happens to have been suspended right at the start of an election campaign.
I'm happy it's suspended, but I'm not keeping my fingers crossed that there won't be another U-turn. But not to rain on your sort of like positive thing, which I think is a good point, but comparing it to the coal kind of crisis in the 50s, one of the imperatives there was that people are dying. Like walk out of if you're the prime minister, you walk out of your office in London and you can see people dying, almost literally. Now, because we've moved the coal far away, we don't see that, right? It's kind of the thing you said before. But okay. So if we want to change the infrastructure powering the internet, we can probably do it very, very quickly.
Yeah, with the will. Yeah. With the will.
Okay.
In terms of like, this is another interesting thing. Where is the people suffering feedback loop around this stuff at the moment? Because like you say, if it's the 50s and the 60s in Britain, I walk out of my house and I can't see anything. And I see people that I know suffering extreme ill health. If it's the 70s, I look at a river and the river is dead and there's sewage on the beach. Okay. I can see that stuff instantly and do it. I think that the people related feedback loop is migration. And more and more, we are going to see migration because of environmental, reasons, water scarcity, pollution, wars taking place in parts of the world where the wars are over,
resources that are
and raw resources. Like a lot of the migration which is happening across Europe and is affecting the UK is being driven from those places, and those are factors, and those factors are only going to grow. There are places where it is not going to be sustainable to live through because of the heat soon, and those people are going to go. And we shouldn't have a separate conversation about the European Union, but regardless,
let's not get into that.
No, exactly. But people are already desperate enough to risk their lives on rubber dinghies trying to get across stretches of water. So it sort of doesn't matter what the law in any one of those countries says. If somebody is prepared to do something so desperate as to get their young children and put them in such extreme risk in the certain knowledge that people will die on the journey that they're on, and they're doing that now, and when the pressure of the heat and the lack of water and the war over the infrastructure and the war over the resources continues to intensify, you're just going to see more and more people trying to move in response to that, and more pressure on the resources and the infrastructure of the places where they're trying to get to. Now, yes, we can stand there with our guards and our guns and our borders, but if people are already doing such desperate things to try and circumvent them, they're not going to stop.
Well, history has shown us that, borders don't really work for very long. Yeah. So, yes. Well, there's just, kind of one other feedback loop is because we live, up in Scotland in the countryside now. We're also seeing a bit of it here already. Spent the last year talking to way more farmers than I ever have in my life, and they're already seeing fluctuations in the seasons, and what that allows them to grow predictably.
Right.
Not to the point where they're being unproductive, like that their farms aren't producing things, but the growing seasons are shorter than you would expect in some parts. So having, for example, a couple of weeks of really hot weather in February and then really cold weather again, and then really hot, that just messes up how you farm.
Yeah.
Because there are some things that need a frost, some things that don't, and that's a feedback loop we don't see. I never saw that feedback loop living in Cambridge or in Aberdeen, or just not a thing we see. But let's wrap it up. Hello again. Thank you for joining us on that episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Gareth Marlow of EQ Systems. As always, please visit fatelayer.blog/contribute to support the show in any way that is possible for you. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next episode.